Okay, so the recordings will be posted on the OCMA website in due process once the conference concludes, and you'll be able to go view them as you need to. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Emily Brown and James Howell, and they'll give us an update on the OCMT.
Thank you, Corey.
So thank you everyone for attending, and thanks Corey for your awesome moderating. So basically we are looking at elevating numeracy in a 100% digital environment. And even when we wrote the abstract for this presentation, we didn't know what was really happening with respect to classrooms, remote teaching, and so on. So I can honestly say that, you know, as time has gone on since the abstract was written and presented, things have changed, and we have quite a bit of new information to add as well.
Yeah.
So we have me, and that's how you can reach me. I'm at Sheridan College. I teach mathematics in both the diploma and the degree. And prior to that, I was with the College Student Achievement Project. And James?
Absolutely. For those of you who don't know me, I'm James Howell, the Manager of Academic Partnerships at Vretta Inc. I oversee the deployment of the OCMT in secondary schools as well as in post-secondary. And it can be reached at the email shown here in this slide.
So on the agenda today, and again, we really wanted to make it different from our past presentations because, of course, we are in a very different environment. And we'll be describing the landscape that that this study has occurred in. So we're going to be looking at the impacts of the pandemic, pluses and minuses of online and remote learning. We're going to re-examine the numeracy gap and sort of where it's going or where we predict it may be going. OCMP deployments, new and improved in response to the pandemic and beyond. Questions and answers, and of course, our contact slide. So I'm going to be starting with what happened in the Ontario secondary schools. So most school boards did defer to online or remote learning at some point during the pandemic. Some boards attempted to create a shorter rotary window using quadmesters or octomesters as an intervention when bringing students back to class. This was a strategy to allow for cohorting of student groups in order to minimize person-to-person contact during the pandemic. So, you know, in the past with numeracy gap reports, we've kind of raised the red flag about semestering mathematics. So maybe we could raise two red flags when we look at quadmestering or octomestering. Octomesters can be like 2 courses, you know, half a day for one, half a day for another course over 6 to 8 weeks. So it's a hard and fast hit of the curriculum. With the Ontario secondary school boards, we've had an expanded access to math tutors, engagement strategies, summer learning programs to bridge gaps between particular grades, courses, and transition to post-secondary. And just hold on, James. So there is a report, right, so the EQAO benchmark tests were not administered in grades 3, 6, and 9 during the pandemic due to limitations, of course, in how to administer, but also concerns that you know, teachers wouldn't be prepared, students are already under a lot of pressure. But what that does is we then enter a data gap where we don't have that EQAO data. The government of Ontario, in a release called Ontario's Learning Recovery Renewal Plan, they are still, of course, acknowledging $200 million to allow for boards to access 200, I don't know where they're getting, 200 math coaches and math leads as part of the math strategy rollout, that 4-year plan. But they have additional funding now, $30 million in tutoring for at-risk and marginalized students, $8.4 million for school boards to create and implement their own tutoring strategies based on student needs in their unique areas, one-on-one online math tutoring through an English language and French language program, Early math intervention, basically identifying gaps earlier and intervening earlier for those needing special education. And some interesting re-engagement strategies where literally individual students and families are contacted and visited by learning strategists and so on to bring them back to school and engagement with school. There's also $62 million for summer learning, and that's where you're going to get the support to bridge the gaps between certain grades, transitioning through courses, and to fill gaps in order to prepare them for post-secondary destinations. So that's something that's of particular interest to us. What we don't know from this document is whether students will be assigned summer learning or whether they will be self-selecting, like, hey, I need help, I'm going to go and take 2 weeks of math in the summer or not. We don't know how those students will be picked.
So there's a question here from Julian. How does the Ministry of Education know where the gaps are without EQAO data? I think that's actually one of the points we're trying to make here, Julian. It's a great question. They don't know. And you'll see later on when we talk about some of the other steps taken and just what's going on. There's other gaps forming that we might not even be aware of.
Yeah, there's a lot of concerns being raised with the EQAO being missed, but also some teachers and teacher unions are suggesting if we can do without it for 1 or 2 years, why do we need it at all? So an interesting commentary. So steps taken with in post-secondary education, of course, with international students, which make up a large proportion of Ontario college students, not being allowed to enter the country due to travel restrictions. Many colleges were forced to deliver programs remotely and for longer. It should be noted that emergency remote learning is not the same as a thoughtful process to move to remote or online learning. So a lot of this really required kind of just-in-time sort of panic strategies. The pandemic pivot to online and remote learning was just as stressful for post-secondary educators as it was for secondary school or elementary even, where the online delivery included recorded lessons, videos, new digital assessments, which was very new, and wherever they were possible. One of the things that should be noted is that there was really no consistency across faculties, across programs, even across courses, what you should be using, whether it should be synchronous or asynchronous, whether your classes should be recorded or not recorded. And so especially in that first, like the 2-week lockdown that we were going to have back in 2020, people just did their own thing, whatever worked in that emergent situation. And since then, of course, we've become more purposeful in our strategy. So yes, deployment of new remote proctoring services were required. So whether it was Lockdown Browser or Top Hat or some other proctoring services, which we as an organization had actually looked at in years prior, like what do you use to proctor your assessments? But during the pandemic, because there was an uptake in usage, those proctoring services became overwhelmed. And the capacity for post-admission placement testing was reduced at some institutions. I mean, our assessment centers closed as well. There were fewer places to go, in fact, no places to go for on-site assessments. And again, that would present a different and also important data gap. Other post-secondary institutions that were already using OCMT were well placed to simply transition to the informal platform. And as a result, there was an increase in usage. So it was just expanded and a fairly smooth transition as compared to other courses, colleges, and so on that sort of scrambled to figure out what to do and how to present the best course possible.
Yeah, and actually, I think a lot of you guys out there, fellow instructors who were using these proctor services, you probably know there was Proctorio, ProctorU, I forget exactly which one, that had the data breach. There was also Examity, which was used for many placement or final exams that had that absolute outage due to their locations being closed down from COVID restrictions. And a lot of the people who were using the placement test simply transitioned to using that informal system. It was quite easy for them to go that way in lieu of not having a proper solution.
So what are the challenges with remote learning? I mean, we could have a day-long presentation on this, but this applies to sort of secondary schools and post-secondary schools to some degree or another. One of the biggest challenges, of course, is access to their own laptop, computer that meets the needs of online learning. One study from StatsCan on internet usage, availability, and internet-enabled devices says that fewer internet-enabled devices are available in lower-income homes. There's often shared access, and lower-income households to a greater degree rely on mobile devices rather than laptop or desktop services. So you can imagine that if you have a family of 4 all now studying at home and a parent working from home, that creates a huge disturbance. One other challenge is a lack of face-to-face interaction and additional support. You know, how do you give students the support they need when, you know, they may not even have their camera on, they may feel disconnected, anonymous, and, you know, they might not even, like, they might not complete work because they think, well, the teacher doesn't know because she doesn't see me, and so on. So in extension of access to Wi-Fi and computer access, there may well be a cramped and shared study space in their home that may feel invasive and discourage anxious learners. In fact, at our college, we were told that, you know, we can't always require a student to have their camera on because there may be others in the home passing by or sitting near that, you know, for freedom of information and privacy and so on, we can't have them within camera space. So there, and again, shared study space can be noisy, can be cramped, and it may feel invasive and discourage anxious learners from participating in their class. International students, of course, in different time zones. You know, I had some standing meetings a few semesters ago on Saturdays at 8 or 9 in the morning, because where my international students were studying, that was an evening, Saturday evening, that they were available to meet with me as their instructor. So with respect to attendance and test taking, you know, some of my students are taking tests at 1 in the morning or 4 in the morning, and, you know, they're perhaps not performing as well as they could. Besides the challenges with remote learning, of course, there is the anxiety of normal stressors that were magnified during this period of lockdown and study from home, taking care of children, taking care of parents, you know, working from home if in the case of post-secondary students and even secondary students, balancing all of those things, and of course worrying about their own individual health and futures. So here's a quote from the educators' response to the COVID-19 pandemic. All students will benefit from instructors who know how to recognize students at risk and put forth effort to connect students to supports using standard tools such as early warning systems and retention centers that employ basic but effective learning analytics. As the 2021 academic calendar proceeds, students are likely to be more vulnerable than ever, struggling both financially and academically. So that was a huge thing I heard from students not being able to afford some online resources or textbooks, and even struggling to pay tuition when their work was also suspended.
This quote comes from the education's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. This was actually done locally here in Ontario. It's a great report. I highly encourage everyone to take a look at it. Another thing I just wanted to kind of add As a side thing, in managing some of the courses and assessments, there was one thing that I didn't know and I learned through this pandemic. International students have their weekends, depending on the country, if they're Muslim specific countries, they actually have their weekends on Friday and Saturday. So we were seeing and getting requests to make accommodations to not have tests run on prayer time if they were scheduled for an overlapping time here in Canada. That was something we hadn't seen before and wasn't even something I was aware of or even thought of. So there certainly were different challenges, and new things came about from this that hopefully we all learned from.
And students felt a lack of motivation at times, and so there was a sense of urgency at test time where they'd been sort of plugging along but not fully committed, and then suddenly realized that assessed work was coming, and there was definitely a higher level of stress.
Yeah.
So challenges with remote learning from an instructor's perspective. Well, again, we thought we were patching things together for 2 weeks, and many instructors had never had online teaching or hybrid teaching experience. And in fact, in a study done in the United States, more than half of faculty in this broad Texas study were using new teaching methods, of course, during the pandemic and pivot to remote learning. And 2/3 of those had never had any experience with teaching online. So it was a huge growth curve for them. So to support instructors going to remote learning, we patched together supports, mentoring. There were webinars in the week, sort of bridging week we had prior to actually starting to teach online in March 2020, where instructors kind of taught other instructors or mentored other instructors. And I have to say, even within that 2 weeks, I had tried everything from WebEx to Kaltura to Zoom, now virtual classroom. I'm like, okay, which works best? But at the time, it was really just in time support. Like, this worked best for this course at this time, and this worked best for this course. So that first semester that was completed online, I actually was using 2 online platforms. I mentioned to James last week when we were preparing this that one of my students communicates through English Sign Language. And so it was really difficult when one of the platforms didn't offer closed captioning abilities and another one did. And of course, it was really challenging for that student to complete the semester. And in fact, they didn't, and they withdrew and took it again in the next semester. And we were both better prepared for it. Again, another challenge, or what we talked about before, was access to resources for both instructors and their students. There's that inability to know their students personally and to build that relationship of trust. I felt in some ways we were just winging it, and I crossed my fingers and was excited when students wanted to meet in a one-on-one Zoom meeting so I could learn a bit more about them and about their motivation for the course and for their studies. But that's really difficult to connect to an entire class full of students. The big question, do my students get it? How do we know? In a classroom, we see a student leaning over to ask another student, for help or clarification, or we see that mystified, puzzled look when we, put some question or some equation on the board. But largely in remote learning, students have their microphones off. There's the chat space that you monitor, but it's really difficult to look at students' faces and their responses, even if their cameras are on, and the chat, and to be teaching coherently, right? So how do we know? There were questions that arose everywhere about academic quality. Is what students are getting remotely just as good as what they would get face-to-face? And try as we might, we don't know. Is that really, are we really delivering a quality product to our students? There, of course, were questions around academic integrity. Anecdotally, there was quite a rise in class averages when we moved from face-to-face paper-based tests to online assessments. So, you know, is it because it's on a familiar platform interface that they use for their online homework, or is there some kind of academic integrity breach going on? And you know, all kinds of strategies were discussed with other instructors about how to mitigate that. And then again, the rigor of assessments, you know, is an online assessment just as rigorous and assessing what we want to have assessed as a paper-based test? So that the jury's still out on that. So just over, prior to the pandemic, just over a third of institutions required any pedagogical training for online instruction. Of course, many had training in, you know, functioning on your LMS, and only about 45% required LMS training even. So the case can be made that this training isn't about achieving, that it's about achieving better learning outcomes for students, and it doesn't inhibit faculty autonomy, right? So there is benefit, and hopefully we're going to see more emphasis when we go back to our faculty training, that new faculty members will be given some online instruction. Sorry, what is this about the opinion report? Can you share the link? Yeah, it's in our resources. Yeah, and this is hyperlinked as well on the slide. So there was a survey done in the US with many instructors across the country to determine what their greatest challenges were with remote learning. And of course, I don't think it's any surprise that, and there were 13 concepts that students found, or instructors found very, very challenging. And they're listed here. And the top one, of course, is testing. And the testing really also refers to academic integrity, you know, the rigor of the assessment and all those things that I mentioned in the last slide. The next highest concern was with student-to-student interaction. And again, building relationship, building trust, also having students collaborate with each other. So they're not, you know, heading off to the library to work on their homework after class, right? And so there isn't that ad hoc or planned interaction. I had a class 2 semesters ago where they actually set up a WhatsApp group for our class, and I thought that was really cool. So they could communicate in real time, hopefully not during the test, but where they could communicate concerns and share help and so on. Again, the next most concerning challenge was instructor-to-student interaction. You know, how do we build a relationship? How do we know, you know, the student and what their specific needs are individually? We try as best we can to get to know our student needs, but with shortened semesters and remote learning, that was really very challenging. Absenteeism, again, that can be because of a sense of anonymity, lack of connection, lack of motivation, anxiety and stress, other work commitments of students, right? They have other, not just work commitments, but personal commitments. So that could contribute to absenteeism. And of course, the time change if you're dealing with students living abroad. Personal teaching style. So, you know, if you're an instructor who, you know, goes around the tables and, you know, chats with students and is very engaging face to face, how do you translate that engagement and style to remote learning? You know, sometimes it feels kind of concocted, you know, if you go in and say something humorous, and it's kind of lost without that face-to-face interaction. Student connectivity refers directly to internet connection and the ability to access. You know, I had a student who said, "Miss, I can't write the midterm at this time because we're expecting a typhoon to come through my community at the time that this midterm is to be written." So it's not like we're all sitting in our Canadian communities with more reliable connectivity. we have students studying from around the globe who do have concerns. Work-life balance, that was a concern of faculty, where basically because of us working remotely, our work things are all over the house. We're expected to meet with students at all times when they're available. We've got kids and husbands and parents and all kinds of things going on. So it's really hard to take a step away and have those defined lines between work and your other life. Time management, same kind of thing. One hour sort of morphs into another, and it's really difficult. There was a study that we reviewed that said that hours increased 52% for faculty in delivering remote learning than face-to-face. And I think that's something initially in our SWIFTs that was addressed, where we got a couple of hours extra for pandemic response or pandemic whatever, and those have been pared back now, despite the fact that we're still getting to know our way around remote learning, and it's not just wash and repeat, right? So those hours are still put in. Remote office hours, again, we used to have a couple of hours in your office, and now those things seem to spread over your entire workday, and if you'll allow it, even your weekends, based again on students studying from different time zones. On a low priority or low challenge were whiteboard use. So what they use to teach synchronously, that seemed to be achievable. Homework assignments, again, they took more time, the study said, but they were manageable. Instructor connectivity, that seemed to be not a problem, although I was saying to James, I have an instructor friend, colleague, who would drive to the parking lot of the community library to access internet when they had to teach, because they don't have dial-up, but whatever the next worst thing is, and their costs for Wi-Fi and data download were prohibitive, so they would actually go and teach in the library parking lot to use their internet. And the LMS, learning management system, most people had experience with that and comfort with that well prior to the pandemic. So anyway, this was really interesting, and while this was completed in the US, I, from my own experience, can see that these are exactly how I would rate these challenges in my own situation.
And I also think it's rather interesting that the onus and emphasis on PD for instructors in post-secondary was on learning management and online homework assignments that we saw on the slide earlier. However, that seems to be the least concern here for the instructors themselves. Like you said, Emily, they're most familiar with that, but that seemed to be the only just-in-time increase in training that post-secondary institutions could provide at the onset of the pandemic. Julian has a question. Are you getting any interest from Ontario College's academic leadership to make your presentation to them?
No, but we could.
Yeah, you can help spearhead that at Fanshawe, Julian.
So interestingly, and again, this was from a study in Texas, but I really feel that it exactly reflects my experience here, where prior to COVID, we are comfortable with our course website. Everyone can put in their grades online, and there was access to online homework. And then, kaboom, things changed. We had a huge uptick in use of online quizzes and tests. How else were we going to assess anything, mathematics, particularly that were paper-based tests, if we didn't evolve and start using online quizzes and tests? And so that translation took a lot of effort and hopefully collaboration with other instructors, but suddenly the use of online quizzes and tests went through the roof. Also instructional videos, which interestingly, I had some experience with when we had our job action 4 years ago. when we came back and we had, you know, basically a 14-week semester crammed into 6 weeks or so. And, you know, teaching business calculus and algebra just wasn't possible in that compressed time. So when we came back from the job action, I started creating these instructional videos, and so have other instructors at Sheridan. But you know, this wasn't something that the majority of instructors had experience with in this study. And again, that went up quite a bit. Video platform as well. And I think, I'm not sure if that refers to, you know, just taping yourself teaching. So it's available asynchronously or that, but again, a huge increase. Again, social media uses, blog uses, some instructors had an increase in usage there. And of course, as I suggested, students were creating social media ways to connect that they didn't before the pandemic.
Great comment here by instructor Norm Morin. Absolutely, you know, a lot of what we do and what has been done in hybrid environments has supplemented things. It's just the classic chalk and talk that most professors were used to now had to be rapidly supplanted, and not everyone was prepared for that. So his question is, do you think the lack of control over intellectual property is perhaps lowering the amount of engagement by educators in fully developing distance learning applications for their courses? That's not something I'm willing to discuss now, but Emily, maybe would you like to opine on that? It's a really, really good question.
I'm maybe a different kind of beast where I create stuff and go, here, use it, this is cool, and kind of share broadly, you know, videos and resources and, you know, ways that I teach and ways that I've incorporated some technology within my instruction. But yeah, I think it could perhaps limit people, and it has been in discussion with our union, of course, about how much is still ours if it's mounted on a public platform like YouTube, for example. Is it still ours? Are we allowed to post it? Is it the colleges? So it's possible. Maybe instructors are taking a minimalist approach, just waiting to go back to face-to-face classes. When I think about teaching math, you know, one thing I think is really cool, and again, I teach synchronously with a whiteboard, so students actually see me write, and I can circle things and arrows and go back and so on and so forth. To me, it's like teaching in the class, but everyone has a front row seat, and everyone has access to whatever I have written, all the planned notes, and then all the supplementary notes that stem from student questions. You know, they have those in infinity, right? They can replay it, stop, record, share, and so on from our LMS, right? So I don't know. I think math is one of the courses that does seem to lend well to remote learning, but I mean, I guess we have to ask the students as well. The students who don't have access to technology, the students who have trouble with connectivity, the students who are learning in a different time zone. So there are those challenges. So there was, again, this response from Jason Opeño, and what he indicated was that there are 3 enduring challenges from teaching remotely, and that is interactivity, authenticity, and support. So the pandemic-related shift to online instruction has had a negative impact on the quality of education, and the main area of engagement of dissatisfaction is the lack of interaction and engagement, and that came from the Ontario Council of University Faculty Associations. So it is suggesting that because you're not able to interact with students face-to-face, that the level of engagement is decreased, and so the quality is deemed less. With respect to authenticity, you know, are they getting the full experience with the instructor? Are you able to teach the way that you would face-to-face? So instructor choices about how to be themselves and where to draw the line in caring for students, how much of their lives they should share. I mean, here you're sitting in my kitchen, you know, students will experience the same thing, you know, kids coming by, dogs, where you live, what your weather is, how much do you share with students, and where do you draw the line between simply being their instructor and counseling? And, you know, I've said that many times that, you know, in course evaluations, people don't say, wow, she really knows that math. It's more about, she really helped me through some difficult times. She really helped when I needed extra support to complete the course successfully. And now we have the additional concerns about mental health, anxiety, and all the stressors that this pandemic has layered on students. So where do we draw the line? The last one is support. All students will benefit. Again, we had this before, from instructors who know and can identify students at risk and put forth that effort to connect them to other systems that will help them, whether it's mental health, whether it's tutoring, whether it's financial services when that becomes the difficulty, and even international concerns about students coming and going from Canada and what's required. So those three things.
Forgive me, Emily, it looks like I accidentally deleted the OCFU link. Later on, let's add it to this presentation.
Yeah, it's the Ontario Council of University Faculty Associations. Yeah.
Yeah, forgive me, it looks like I deleted the one here too.
That's all right. I didn't on my copy, thankfully. So we're looking at the numeracy gap in the near term. So goodness, we have, you know, students who are inconsistently in and out of secondary school. We have post-secondary students who are disengaged, who are absent, who may not be committing to their learning as they should. And so what's going to happen? So this is actually a study that we found that named this the academic debt of COVID-19's impact. And this debt is mounting as each month or each semester goes by, where we're not able to come together and address this learning loss. And so what's it going to cost? So this particular study, McKinsey study, they suggested that there would need to be a $66 billion investment in the United States simply to respond to 50% of school children in the United States and supply tutoring daily in math, to provide by a pair of professionals, so tutors, math experts, and so on, that there would be 2 students per semester, and it would cost $2,500 per student per year. So if we were to take that amount proportionally to Ontario, we could say that the proportional spending would be about $6.6 billion investment across Canada and a $3.3 billion investment in Ontario to address this anticipated and mounting learning loss. And so if we look at the re-estimated data, in 2003, 49% of adults had inadequate numeracy skills. In 2012, that jumped to 55%. And despite all efforts to improve adult numeracy rates in Canada, the share of adults with inadequate numeracy skills has increased over the past 10 years. So we certainly can't anticipate that it's going to be improving.
It's a great concept and term there, the academic debt of the pandemic, and putting it in numbers of cash value actually, to me, speaks larger than, you know, an infographic here about 10 months. I feel like the pandemic was much longer than 10 months. So when I look at this, I don't feel like it does justice, but when I see 66 billion for half of the United States and we put that in terms to Canada, it really does speak to me. So with everything we've just seen here, we're seeing 2 trends side by side. Julian actually properly identified one of them, and that's a data gap. So not only locally here in Ontario, we're also seeing a data gap internationally. The two OCED studies that the OCMT typically looks at are the Program for International Student Assessment, as well as the Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies. Those were stayed and not surveyed across OCED countries during the pandemic. We also saw, as we mentioned earlier on, the EQAO forwent its testing in grade 3, 6, and 9. That's definitely a data gap. And then even some Ontario institutions, there was a disruption in placement testing because of the online proctors. They don't have the data on their current students. So the question is, do we have sufficient data to intervene or pivot when things start sliding down? I don't really know at this point. The other thing we're seeing is just the effects of all the transition from the pandemic pivot that we cited earlier on. So the rapid transition to online, there was positives, there was benefits in this, but it's hard to imagine, and it's improper for us to assume that these rapid transitions will affect, different student demographic, socioeconomic, or geographically related groups consistently. A gap in one area, might benefit some people versus the others, those people who have access to tutors and those who do not. Perhaps the gap is going to widen between the haves and have-nots. The overall impacts, because we're still in the middle of it, remain to be seen. But the goal of this is to really decide how we can best prepare for the way forward and the transition back to. So in our research, Emily and I, we found lots of different things here. There's going to be a slide at the end with all of the different reports we pulled these infographics from. We also found one that might speak to something you as math instructors already know. And the OCMT certainly has data on this from the CSAT project, is that unfinished math learning gives longer term consequences. So what this infographic is showing here on the left is students at the 4th grade level of math in the 8th grade and the likelihood of them ever catching up. So students who are off track, half of them will never, at this point in time, half of them will never catch up. And then, students who are far off track, 10% of them will just never, ever catch up. A similar trend here when we look at grade 8 scores, that's a pivotal one right before grade 9 and grade 12, which are incoming into post-secondary. Less pronounced, but a very, very similar difference between the on-track and the far off-track. We also have other research that show disruptions can have cumulative effects and lowering the chance of secondary school completion. This is something we saw directly in CSAP as well. I'm sure all of you are familiar with that infographic. If not, we can share that with you. Also, other studies from the past crises, localized in different areas and disruptions are more concerning. I think this quote actually looked at the earthquake in Haiti, Emily, if I'm correct on that. The second
earthquake in New Zealand. So
New
other
Zealand.
crises and what happened there and what they found when things went back to normal. Yeah.
So even after things return to normal, those impacts will have a lasting effect. Okay. Further research, I really like these types of ideas here. I'm sure you guys are familiar with the iceberg. 1/10 of it is above the water, the rest of it is below. So the iceberg problem is how learning skills is compounding at the bottom in those foundations that are just not there. But you cannot see the tip. It looks smaller and smaller as this, that the gap and the skills missed is smaller and smaller, but really it's mounting underneath and forming down there, just kind of waiting to, rip into the side of the pandemic. The Titanic, forgive me, everything's pandemic these days. So there's also another idea emerging that we saw about a possible snowball effect here. We already know the numeracy gap's been widening in Ontario in both adults and students. We know it's a key indicator of success, but we don't know what the predicted effects are other than college administrators and instructors are saying. Thank you for that, Dory. We'll try and get through this as quickly as possible. That cohorts are going to be less prepared. Another thing that we didn't really have time to delve into is what I like to call the Trojan horse, is the impacts of de-streaming. We really don't know how that is going to impact everything, whether it'll further amplify it or mitigate it. but basically the gap is widening and we're all falling through. So again, on that onus or that motive of what can we do not to be so dire. And yes, there is an amassing storm on the horizon, but what can we do? Okay. I want to talk about some of the positive initiatives during the pandemic that happened. So with, a response to this does come innovation. One thing we saw very early on in the pandemic was the Ontario College Library Service. They have their own learning portal through College Libraries Ontario. This is available to all Ontario College students. They came to the OCMT almost immediately at the onset of the pandemic and said, how can we get these modules and diagnostic access out there? They chose the informal system because proctoring was not available to them. They saw the limitations and the librarians heard what was happening, the ear to the ground, students coming to them for help. So they chose to have those psychometrically backed items instead of making their own, and to lean on the power of the OCMT to really use the upgrading modules and diagnostic tool to create a unique numeracy boosting initiative. The infographics here, I'll share this link with you after it. It's available to each and every one of the students in the Ontario College system. The funds have been allocated to September 2022, and at that point, they'll look to renew it. If you know a student who needs additional support and your college doesn't have anything available to them or is not using the OCMT, please feel free to send your students to this. They have the chance to get the upgraded, the badge, the digital badge, and the library is marketing this to bring awareness to the initiative. Some other key responses in Ontario: Humber College, the lead institution of the OCMT, they reached out to different secondary schools and YMCAs and different summer learning programs with all the money going there to deploy the OCMT High School Edition. This was to prepare students coming into post-secondary. St. Lawrence College, they adopted the OCMT informal. They had success in business. They brought it into health sciences for BSCN as well as practical nursing. This is available for all. That's actually required for all incoming students across all three campuses. Also, Fanshawe College, they actually started this conversation in the school within a college to bring the Ontario High School edition of the college math test to their students for general education and introduction into math. But during the pandemic, that kind of pivoted, as we see a lot of things are, and they actually deployed it more often to more students during the pandemic, specifically for pre-business. That's where they're seeing the most effect. Outside of Ontario, we also saw expanded usage of the OCMT. The informal system had quite a successful run at the largest colleges in both prairie provinces, Manitoba and Saskatchewan. I hope we don't consider Alberta also prairie province, because I miss them in that definition, but it expanded into pre-employment trades, veterinary tech, international education. It's available for all students there. We also saw a huge increase in usage at Sask Polytech. I did want to take a look at the case study. It's something to look for. We are going to be publishing this on social media. They actually initiated conversations for the formal placement test prior to the pandemic, and then quickly, rapidly changed to the informal because they did not have a proctoring solution. It is currently being used for all incoming students in the schools of technology and trades at Sask Polytech. And we can look here actually pre and post. I'm going to go super quick. That doesn't deal with justice here. It was initially deployed through learning services as a voluntary resource. This is just a snapshot of the data. You can see the pre and post scores for just less than 100 students. Was not meeting the desired outcome that Sask Polytech wanted to see. However, we collaborated with them. We listened to the math faculty, the administrators, and worked with learning services who had their, their ear to the ground in that college. They have 5 locations across the province, and we re-innovated it and persevered through the pandemic to get a better application of the OCMT informal. So you can see here, your incoming scores, 59 to 21 doesn't look good at all. And then what we saw after that innovation, after that collaboration, the diagnostics also increased, but we saw massive improvement. Look at that for topic 5, your pre-score at 65 and your post at 92. This is an extremely successful deployment of the OCMT informal. And we also saw engagement go from about less than 100 to over 400 by differentiating the groups and creating multiple sections. I don't really need to go into how it works. You can probably contact us for an individual demo at your college. but it is a 3-component assessment platform that includes the upskilling and upgrading to allow students to exceed before that outgoing test. So there's always a pre-test, your diagnostic, and a post-test, and that formative piece in between. Just going to run through that because we don't have time. It is mobile compatible. We designed this to be available to each and every learner everywhere possible. We're very excited to get this into the hands of learners and see where it can be used in different ways, whether it's the high school app, the informal app, or the formal placement tool. It is something that can find those data gaps as well as intervene and respond before the gap becomes too large. We have deployments of the OCMT both formally and informally in the province of Ontario, Francophone as well as Anglophone, the Prairie provinces, provincially wide through the learning portal, as well as in several of the largest high schools here in the GTA region, and some of them actually quite far. I think BSBO is all the way up in Cornwall, and Northern Catholic District School Boards all the way up in Moosonee. So pretty much coast to coast in the province. Still waiting for out west. But yeah, it is a growing initiative, and it's something we're quite proud of, and we'd like you to join us. And I'm seeing some questions in the chat. I apologize I haven't been able to do it, but I think now we'll take some time for Q&A. Emily, were you looking at the questions?
I was looking at questions, and it's more just conversation between instructors. And I just saw one that said they had 400 plus students, and that is incredible. Wow.
Yeah, no, and it's great to see that this presentation is encouraging and engaging the faculty into this type of conversation. So at this point, we're open to questions
and experiences. Yeah.
I'll just stop sharing so we can all see each other and any hands that come up.
Hi, Paul. Good, how are you?
We're just going to mute Maria.
Yes. Okay. Oh, sorry about that. Maria's getting ready for our next session.
Okay.
Okay. Actually, I will comment. It was one of the wonderful things I like seeing about our OCMA presentations is how it inspires people. And I guess now that we're online, it inspires people to go really quickly and really meet new friends online. So I hope that conversation will be able to continue as they do that. Before we let Emily and James go, any other questions for them?
For me, one of the most exciting things that started developing before the pandemic and was a welcome addition to the availability of this, of the OCMT, is our partnership with the libraries. The resources, Heather, they'll be available. It's amount of money that went in, so it's basically a drawdown budget, which could be renewed if it's empty, but nominally that agreement is available until September 2020. So please share with your other math faculty that the OCMT is available as a free resource through their library portal. So even if your institution doesn't, doesn't do post-admission testing or remedial support in mathematics, this is an amazing resource that's available to us. And again, the negotiation started before the pandemic, and what a brilliant time to have it available.
I see a question from Heather here as well. How long will the resources be on the learning portal again? It's the funds are allocated until September 1st. So
2022.
2022, yes.
Yeah, I said that.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just reading through everything to see if there's anything else. Okay, awesome.
All right. Well, thank you very much to Emily and James.
Thank you.
Anyone interested in revisiting the presentation, and of course they have lots of links that they will need to share as well. So all of the material will be posted on the OCMA website in the coming weeks, and you'll be able to revisit it as needed. So we thank you to our presenters, and if anyone's staying around, our next session will be in about 4 minutes. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye now.